You ever been called a Nazi? Do you really know what the hell that term means? Hello, all you beautiful people. World's okayest lawyer here. Before I get started, I want to point out that I tend to lean left on most social issues. But even with that, I've been called a Nazi online. If you read Wikipedia, you will find that it is posted that Nazism is a far right movement. However, that is actually not true. If your knowledge is that Nazism was because of Hitler, that is also not true. It's also not true if whatever political party that you are affiliated with calls people from the opposite party a Nazi, because that's also not what it means. As a lawyer, words have meaning, and it drives me crazy when people misuse words. So, what is true? Nazism is a form of fascism with disdain for liberal democracy and the parliamentary system. It incorporates a dictatorship, fervent anti Semitism, anti communism, anti Slavism, scientific racism, white supremacy, Nordicism, social Darwinism, and the use of eugenics into its creed like holy hell. Did you catch all that? Stick with me. If you do not know what eugenics is, for example, to break it down easily, it is the idea that removal of some from the gene pool, particularly through focusing and selling the idea of abortions on segments of society that the movement believed they were above. So, for example, Nazis believed they were above German people. They believed they were essentially above anybody that was not German. And so they were of the idea under eugenics that anybody who was non-German or non-pure in their mind, so if you're German, don't go marry somebody who's non-German, that you were a great candidate for eugenics and for an abortion. As for Nazism, it comes from the Völkisch nationalism philosophers such as Johann Fichte, Wilhelm Rehl, paved the way for German nationalist views. Fichte's German nationalism was populist and opposed to traditional elites, spoke of the need for a people's war, Volkskrieg. Now keep in mind that this was when Germany was below France. Like, you had just come out of the Napoleonic Wars and all that. So this is where this thinking really begins to materialize. And he put forth concepts similar to those which the Nazis later adopted in the 20th century. Fichte promoted German exceptionalism and stressed the need for the German nation to purify itself, including purging the German language of French words. Now, I want to point out, in America, we have the idea of American exceptionalism. But keep in mind, we also believe that we are a nation of immigrants, plus Native Americans, that we are exceptional because of our immigration status, not because of some sort of a bloodline. So that is a huge difference if you hear the idea of American exceptionalism versus German exceptionalism, at least at that time. Rehl, whose work Land und Lut collectively tied the organic German folk to its native landscape and nature, a pairing which stood in stark opposition to the mechanical and materialistic civilization which was then developing as a result of industrialization. So you have to keep in mind that now you're starting to get combustion engines, and the use of oil and things under the Industrial Revolution is really ramping up. And the ideal Germany, in their view, was one where you are essentially seeing the landscape, looking at Mont Blanc, for example, or looking at the rolling hills that you see in The Sound of Music, where she's spinning around the countryside. That was the ideal Germany in these people's view. Völkisch nationalism denounced soulless materialism, individualism, and secularized urban industrial society. So, by God, don't have a Chanel purse in Nazi Germany, while advocating a superior society based on ethnic German folk culture, and German blood. It denounced foreigners and foreign ideas and declared that Jews, Freemasons, and others were traitors to the nation and unworthy of inclusion. Volkish nationalism saw the world in terms of natural law and romanticism, and it viewed societies as organic, extolling the virtues of rural life, condemning the neglect of tradition and the decay of morals, denounced the destruction of the natural environment, and condemned cosmopolitan cultures such as Jews and Romani. The Nazis were not even the first to attempt Volkisch. It was first adopted by the German Workers' Party. And then later in 1896, a non-form of Marxist socialism was created by the National Social Association. The concept of the Aryan race, which the Nazis promoted, stems from racial theories asserting that Europeans are the descendants of Indo-Iranian settlers, people of ancient India and ancient Persia. Johann Herder created the foundation for the concept of the Aryan race to draw a distinction between what they deemed to be high and noble Aryan culture versus that of parasitic Semitic culture. Now keep in mind, Semitic doesn't just mean Jewish. It also includes Arabs, as Arabs also speak a Semitic language. Arthur de Gobineau, a French racial theorist and aristocrat, blamed the fall of the Ancien Regime in France on racial degeneracy caused by racial intermixing, which he argued had destroyed the purity of the Aryan race, a term which he only reserved for Germanic people. Aryan mysticism claimed that Christianity originated in Aryan religious traditions and that Jews had usurped the legend from Aryans. In Germany, the belief that Jews were economically exploiting Germans became prominent due to the ascendancy of many wealthy Jews into prominent positions upon the unification of Germany in 1871. That sounds not all that different than what some have been espousing over the last 12 months or so. From 1871 to the early 20th century, German Jews were overrepresented. Keep in mind this with quotation marks, in Germany's upper and middle class. Johann Gottlieb Fichte accused Jews in Germany of having been and inevitably of continuing to be a state within a state that threatened German national unity. So this idea of a state within a state is when you see particularly like Hasidic Jews, they tend to be within their own communities. They follow their own morals and their own views, but that's not all that different than, what you have with Dunkers in the United States. Now, getting to Hitler, he and other Nazi legal theorists were inspired by America's institutional racism and saw it as the model to follow. What a model. In particular, they saw it as the model for the expansion of territory and the elimination of indigenous inhabitants therefrom, for laws denying full citizenship for African Americans, which they wanted to implement also against Jews, and for racist immigration laws banning some races. Now, keep in mind that what this is alluding to is essentially Democrat Party laws that they came up with. Think of it along the lines of separate but equal. Slavery altogether. A rise of the Ku Klux Klan. This was all Democrat Party that the Nazis were pulling from at the time that Hitler and essentially those who were in power were kind of putting this together in roughly the 19-teens, 1920s. In Mein Kampf, if you don't know what that is the book that Hitler wrote, and it was actually required reading when I was in roughly 6th grade. Hitler, in that book, extolled America as the only contemporary example of a country with racist, Volkisch citizenship statutes in the 1920s. And Nazi lawyers made use of the American models in crafting laws for Nazi Germany. Again, keep in mind that we didn't have civil rights laws until 1964. And that was when you had a big push of the Republican Party within Congress that was ultimately signed by Lyndon B. Johnson, who was a Democrat. In fact, the Democratic Party was wholly against him pushing this, but he did it in remembrance of JFK. So, a little history tidbit there. Stripped of its ideological overtones, the Nazi vision of modernization without internal conflict in a political community that offered both security and opportunity was so potent a vision of the future that many Germans were willing to overlook its racist and anti-Semitic essence. Nazism rejected the Marxist concept of class conflict, and it praised both German capitalists and German workers as essential to the Volksgemeinschaft. In that theory, Vulcan's Gemeinschaft, social classes would continue to exist, but there would be no class conflict between them. Hitler said that the capitalists have worked their way to the top through their capacity and as the basis of this selection, which only, again, proves their higher race. They have a right to lead. German business leaders cooperated with the Nazis during their rise to power and received substantial benefits from the Nazi state after it was established, including high profits in state-sanctioned monopolies and cartels. For example, Ferdinand Porsche of Porsche Motors, under Hitler and Nazism, created the Volkswagen Beetle, which we call the bug or slug bug. It was viewed by Hitler as the people's car. These sorts of views also really aren't that different than what we see today in China with non-Marxist communist capitalism. So you're having people who are rising to the top, who are the cream, who are the smart, who are the intelligent. These business people also serve the state. So what we are currently seeing in China is not all that dissimilar to what we were seeing under Nazi Germany. While the Nazis had substantial support amongst the middle class, they often attacked traditional middle class values, and Hitler personally held great contempt for them. This was because the traditional image of the middle class was one that was obsessed with personal status, material attainment, and quiet, comfortable living, which was in opposition to the Nazism's ideal of a new man. The Nazis' new man was envisioned as a heroic figure who rejected a materialistic and private life for a public life and a pervasive sense of duty, willing to sacrifice everything for the nation. If you've ever seen posters that were done by Joseph Goebbels, they would show an Aryan man, usually pretty brawny, holding the Nazi flag and essentially being that symbol of the new man that the Nazis were seeking. The aspect of conservative values that were actually within the Nazi movement was when it came to women. Nazis excluded women from political involvement, confining them to the spheres of Kinder, Kirk, children, kitchen, church. Although there were hierarchies even with women. Among National Socialist ideologues, marriage was valued not for moral consideration, but because it provided an optimal breeding environment. So this new man, who was all brawny and Aryan and all for nationalism, also was pumping out a lot of kids. Nazis were hostile to the LGBT, but also religions that opposed the German state. Nazis preached a positive Christianity, which even spun that Jesus was born an Aryan. Hitler called the Old Testament the Devil's Bible. Nazis even initially opposed Catholicism until the Vatican endorsed a pro-Nazi Catholic Kreuz und Adler on July 20th of 1933, and this is when the Catholic Church within Germany started aligning with German nationalism and Nazism. When it came to economics, the Nazis opposed Marxism. So again, anti-Marxism, anti-Slavism, in particular the push of trade unions, which we still have here in the United States. So if you're a member of a union, congratulations, that is Marxism. That's a communist mindset. But even with this opposition, Nazis instituted socialist economic policies where the focus was on nationally supported projects with an eye towards employing every able-bodied male. Any male not able-bodied was viewed as inferior, so do not be handicapped in Nazi Germany. According to historian Richard Overy, the Nazi war economy was a mixed economy that combined free markets with central planning, and described the economy as being somewhere in between the command economy of the Soviet Union and the capitalist system of the United States. Again, today's China. So if you think about it, communism is ultra-left, while the economic policies of the U.S. at the time, so the 19-teens, 1920s, 1930s, would be just considered conservative capitalist or right-wing policies. Even under FDR in 2024, FDR would be considered a conservative in a lot of ways. Nazi propaganda posters in working class districts emphasize anti-capitalism, such as one that said the maintenance of a rotten industrial system has nothing to do with nationalism. I can love Germany and hate capitalism. Under Nazism, with its emphasis on the nation, individualism was denounced, and instead importance was placed upon Germans belonging to the German Volk and people's community, Volksgemeinschaft. Hitler declared that every activity and every need of every individual will be regulated by the collectivity represented by the party, and that there are no longer any free realms in which the individual belongs to himself. So essentially, every person belongs to the state. So it's not really conservative, or right-wing, but it's not really Marxist. Again, what does it sound like? It sounds like today's China and how the Chinese government and populace is actually controlled, or ran, if you don't want to use the word controlled. So how can one act like a Nazi? Here's a list. Hate Jewish people. Hate those who are LGBT. Hate religion that goes against the state's ideals or even your ideals. So if you badmouth a person who is of a different sect of Christianity, you're kind of acting like a little bit like a Nazi. Hate Freemasons. Be nationalistic in a forceful manner. So it's one thing to be nationalistic, like I myself, have served in the process of retiring from the military. I'm very nationalistic in that I love America. But again, I love America because we are a nation of immigrants plus Native Americans, and I agree with those ideals. To be a Nazi, you must be for a dictatorship with the idea of socializing the economy. If you do these things, then you are indeed acting as a Nazi. However, the idea that is right-wing movement is just simply absurd. It is right of communism, again, but it is still a socialist movement, which is still ultimately left of capitalism. And it's not just the economy, it's how they run their people, to where they are controlled by the state. When you have any sort of control of the state, that lends itself to Nazism, Marxism, communism, socialism. Those are all left-wing ideals. And again, I tend to lean left, particularly socially, conservatively, I kind of like my money. I kind of think taxation is theft, for example. So I'm going to make this real simple. What is a Nazi? It is a left-wing, hateful person who only does not oppose their own ideas, who under a totalitarian rule, yet firmly against Slavic people. So again, a Nazi is a left-wing, hateful person who opposes essentially anything and anybody that is against their views under a totalitarian dictatorship, And you also, you know, you hate, Jews, Slavics, any religion that's not yours, any sort of people that are of different blood or different race. That would all kind of be kind of what a Nazi is. It is not somebody who has necessarily a different view than you do. If you are a socialist and somebody's like, yeah, I'm more centrist, that does not make them a Nazi. If you're calling them a Nazi, then you're actually the one being a Nazi. So I created this because, again, words have meaning. So if you're going to use the word Nazi, please use it right. Like what I had to say? Please be sure to follow, like, and subscribe to me on whatever social media you saw this posted. I cannot thank you enough for listening to what my world's okayest opinions are. Lastly, it costs $0 to be kind. It's the best money that you'll ever spend. Until next time, beautiful people, peace.